Hello, welcome to Revelations and Grace. I'm John Paul, and today we're continuing our series on the end times. In a previous video, we discussed how when Christ died on the cross and rose from the dead with many saints, as indicated in Matthew 27, and they ascended into heaven together, that began the millennium reign of Christ. And in the last video, we discussed how from the perspective of the first century disciples, all the events associated with the end of the millennium were promised to occur soon and without delay. And I'd highly encourage you to go watch that because it demands that this millennial period was a shorter period than a literal 1,000 years. And that is the question, because his ascension began around 70 AD, and the millennium was expected to end soon around the time the temple fell in 70 AD. Well, that's a roughly 40-year period. So if Revelation is describing a millennium, how could that represent 40 years? Well, Revelation is a book written full of symbols, and this is indicated in the very first verse of Revelation. It says, a revelation of Jesus Christ that God gave him to show to his servants what things must quickly come to pass. And he signified it, having sent through his messenger to his servant John. That word signified there, that means it's communicated in signs. And this was ordained by God. Revelation was written in apocalyptic language, and it might have been because Revelation foretold the destruction of Jerusalem, which is a very dangerous message for Christians to be sharing, especially during the Neronic persecution. So it might have been that John wrote in this coded language in order to get the message out safely to Christians who are reading these letters. And we see evidence throughout the book of Revelation that it's being written in symbols. For instance, John sees a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And the angel later tells John, the beast that you saw with the 7 heads, that represents 7 kings and 7 hills upon which the kings sit. And the 10 horns represent 7 kings who have not yet obtained power. So although John is literally seeing a beast, what it symbolically means, it represents those 7 kings and 7 hills. So right there's clear evidence, and even the angel tells John, this book is written in symbols, and we need to be prepared to interpret it that way. And so when we are trying to interpret a book of symbols, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the first century audience, the people hearing John's words, and think, how would this have meant to them? What would this have meant to them? How did they understand this? And once we figure out what it would have meant to them, then we can find applications for us. But first we need to identify what the millennium meant to them, what this 1,000 years would have meant to John's audience. And this idea of a non-literal millennium is derived from scriptures that highlight the ultimate Sabbath rest and how they were understood by the early Christians and Jewish rabbis. Throughout the Old Covenant, their practices and promises were shadows of the new covenant realities. For instance, the lamb sacrifice, that was a picture of Jesus' ultimate sacrifice on the cross, how he was the Lamb of God who would give his blood for us, for our forgiveness of sins. And there's other shadows in it. For instance, the earthly Jerusalem was a shadow of the heavenly Jerusalem that was to come. We see that in Galatians 4. And the old fleshly Israel, Israel who were the physical descendants of Abraham, they were a shadow of the new Israel by faith. What was going to happen, and these verses indicate this. And I can scroll through some of them here so you can see. But old Israel was going to continue to be Israel if they continued to believe in their Messiah. But those who in Israel who rejected the Messiah, they were going to be taken out of Israel. They were no longer going to be counted as part of Israel, even though they were Abraham's physical descendants. And the Gentiles, if they put their faith in the Messiah, would be grafted in to Israel. So Israel was going to become those who put their faith in the Messiah, not just those who were physically born children of Abraham. And this is so powerful because it shows again that shadow in reality. Well, also the Old Covenant Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath in the Old Covenant Promised Land, the land of Israel, those were shadows of the ultimate rest provided in the New Covenant and in heaven. And it represented the eternal Sabbath in the kingdom of heaven. During Moses' time, God promised the Israelites a land full of blessings. It was a land of rest where everything was ready for them: food, cities, houses, wells, and vineyards. However, they failed to enter this land because they relied on their own strength instead of God's power. They dismissed the fact that God had mightily delivered them from Egypt, and they became afraid of the giants in the land. And because they stopped trusting in God, the result was they were cursed with never being able to enter God's rest. And this context is important for helping us understand the implications for the ultimate Sabbath rest that God provided in heaven. The first century Christians and Jewish rabbis believed that the world was divided into 7 figurative millennia, corresponding to the 7 days of creation. In Genesis 2, verses 2 through 3, God created the world in 7 days, and on the 7th day he rested. And Psalm 90, verse 4 says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are just like yesterday when it is past, like a watch in the night." And because of this, the early Christians and Jews understood that the world was going to end in 7,000 years. That's often how it was interpreted. And they believed that the days of the Messiah, the Messianic era, was going to be the 6th millennia. It was going to be right before the eternal Sabbath. And during this period, they believed it was going to include the wars of Gog and Magog, and it was going to include the Leviathan and the sea monsters. And at the end of it would come God's kingdom, and that would mark the 7th millennium, the cosmic Sabbath, which they said would be an eternal period. That period was going to last forever. And some of the sources for these ideas come out of the Socino Zohar, which was a collective work of early Jewish thought, and the Sanhedrin Talmud, which is a comprehensive work written between 200 to 500 AD, and it preserves many of the oral traditions taught by the Jewish rabbis in the first century. Now, these teachings aren't reliable for Christian doctrine. These are unbelieving Jews. But it does show us the culture and opinions that was familiar to John's audience, and it helps us understand the context and communication methods of that time. Well, we see, for instance, in the, let's see here, in the Sefer Zohar, this is the source for it. It's a little hard to read, so I'm going to be reading my quote directly. It says, "The Israel sin and the king of Babylon got the upper above calculation of the Messianic era." So here he's talking about the Messianic era. "Rest on the hand. That light was covered up and the darkness prevailed. Supposition, that of the 7 millenniums." So here's referring to the 7 millenniums. "Of the here below and the angels below ceased from giving present aeon. The 7th is to be considered as the outlight, and then the power symbolized by the letter cosmic Sabbath. The 6th as the time of the Messiah." So the Messiah, his era was going to be the 6th millennium. It's a little difficult to understand the language here, but that's what he's saying. The world is divided into 7 millenniums, and the Messiah is the 6th millennium. And here's another work, the Sanhedrin Talmud, and we're going to be reading from sections 97b, 3, just section 3. It says, Rav, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of these Jewish names right, so give me grace there. But Rav Hanan bar Talifa sent a message to Rav Yosef. "I found one man, and in his hand there was a scroll, written in Asherit script, and in the sacred tongue, Hebrew. I said to him, 'From where did this scroll come into your possession?' He said to me, 'I was hired to serve in the Roman army, and I found the scroll among the Roman archives.' It was clear that the scroll was written by Jews, not Romans. And it is written in the scroll, 'After 4,291 years have elapsed from the creation of the world will end. During those years there will be wars of sea monsters between the Leviathan and the animals. And among those years there will be the years of Gog and Magog, and the remaining years of the Messianic period. Then the world will be destroyed. And the Holy One, blessed be He, will renew His world only after a passage of 7,000 years. Rav Aha, son of Rava, says that it was stated after the passage of 5,000 years. So we see that the Jewish rabbis believed again that the world was divided into 7,000 years. And the Messianic era was going to be the 6th millennium, and it was going to include the battles of Gog and Magog and the Leviathan and the animals. Well, this belief wasn't just shared among the Jewish rabbis. Early Christian scholars also interpreted the same way. Irenaeus was an early church father, and he wrote between 175 and 185 AD. And he also believed that the world was divided into 7 millennia. And at the end of the 6,000 years, that would establish the eternal Sabbath period, the true Sabbath of the righteous. In his book, Against Heresies, Book 5, Chapter 28, he says, "For in as many days as this world was made, and so many thousand years shall it be concluded. And for this reason the Scripture says, Thus the heaven and earth were finished, and all their adornment. And God brought to a conclusion upon the 6th day the works which he had made, and God rested upon the 7th day from all his works." Genesis 2:2. This is an account of things formerly created, as also it is a prophecy of what is to come. For the day of the Lord is as 1,000 years, 2 Peter 3:8. And in 6 days created things were completed. It is evident, therefore, that they will come to an end at the 6,000th year. And then in chapter 33, he also adds, "For what are the hundredfold rewards in this world, the entertainments given to the poor, and the suppers from which a return is made? These are to take place in the times of the kingdom." So he's talking about the times of the kingdom. "That is, upon the 7th day, which has been sanctified, in which God rested from all the works which he created, which is the true Sabbath of the righteous." So that 7th day, that 7th millennium, was going to be the reality, the true Sabbath of the righteous. And that was going to be the times of the kingdom. That was when the kingdom of heaven was going to be established. And there's another early church father, I believe, I can't remember his name, but he also believed this. And so we have more than one source. I just included one here. But many Christians think that the Messianic era is going to be a time of great peace and prosperity, and there might have been some peace and prosperity in it. However, the early Jewish rabbis didn't believe it this way. They saw it as a time of intense sorrow and anguish. There is a scholar, he was a 19th century English bishop, biblical scholar, and theologian. His name was Brooke Foss Westcott, and he wrote this work here, and this is where I'm getting his quote from. And in his writing, he says, "Jewish teachers distinguished a present age, this age, from that age, the age to come. Between the present age of imperfection and conflict and trial, and the age to come of the perfect reign of God, they placed the days of the Messiah, which they sometimes reckoned in the former, sometimes in the latter, and sometimes distinct from both. They were, however, commonly agreed that the passage from one age to the other would be through a period of intense sorrow and anguish, the travail pains of the new birth." Matthew 24:8. "The apostolic writers, fully conscious of the spiritual crisis through which they were passing, speak of their own time as the last days." And he gives some verses for that. "The last hour," and he gives a verse for that. "The end of times," gives a couple of verses for that. And "the last time," Jude 18. So this period was marked as a period of intense sorrow and anguish, not exactly a time of peace and prosperity. Ed Stevens, he's a scholar living today, and he does great work. He studied some of these Jewish rabbis and what they taught, and he published, or he has a PDF that he shared with me, and I think it's unpublished, but you can email him and ask him for it, and it's also hosted on my website. But this is his understanding of his research. After researching it, he said this: "Rabbis generally agreed that there were 3 basic eras of God's redemptive work: this world or age, the days of the Messiah, and 3, the world or age to come. They did not agree on how long this world and the days of the Messiah would last, but they all seemed to agree that the world to come would last forever. Most rabbis felt that the days of the Messiah would either be the last days of this world or an intermediate period of time between this age and the age to come. There were different opinions about how long the days of the Messiah would be like, or how they would be like, and how much good would actually be experienced in those days versus how much would be reserved for the world to come. The following quotes from rabbinical sources show that there were some pre-Christian rabbis who taught the idea of a transition period of 40 years, and that this transition period was also labeled as a millennium, or 1,000 years. Therefore, the preterist idea of a 40-year millennium has to be considered a possible, if not the probable, interpretation of the Revelation 20 millennium text. Here's what several Jewish and Christian scholars have to say about it. And here's that quote that I mentioned earlier, and he gives several others. And again, you can go to my article and you can read this for yourself. But I'm going to be looking at one of them. And he says something so interesting, that although the early rabbis called the Messianic era the 6th millennium, it was also noted to be a period much shorter than an actual millennium. And if we look back in that source for the Sanhedrin Talmud, I'm going to show you right here in section 99a, sections 2 through 8. We're going to be reading this in my blog quote because it's a little easier to follow. They actually even said it would be 40 years. It was taught in a Bereda, and I'm reading from the Sanhedrin Talmud. Rabbi Eliezer says, the Messianic era will be 40 years long. As it is stated, 40 years I will strive with that generation. Psalms 95:10. The 40 years of strife with the Gentiles will be followed by the glory days of the Messiah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says the Messianic era will last 70 years. As it is stated, and it shall come to pass on that day that Tyre shall be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. Isaiah 23:15. In this context, one means unique. Which is the unique king? You must say that it is a reference to the Messiah. Rabbi Yehuda Hanazi says, the Messianic era will last 3 generations, as it is stated. May they fear you as long as the sun and moon endure, throughout the generations. Dor Dorim, Psalm 72:5. Dor is singular and Dorim is plural, for a total of 3 generations. Rabbi Eliezer says, the Messianic era will be 40 years long, as it is written here with regard to the 40-year sojourn of the children of Israel in the wilderness. And he afflicted you, and suffered you to hunger, and fed you with manna. That's Deuteronomy 8:3. And it is written here, make us glad according to the days that you afflicted us, and the years that we saw evil. Psalms 90:15. This is powerful, and I want you to notice how he's interpreting these passages, because we're going to come back to this later. He's interpreting Psalm 90:15 as a prophecy of the Messianic era. And he derives from that the Messianic era is going to last for 40 years. So we'll discuss that in a minute. Again, there's a couple other rabbis who believe the Messianic era would last 400 years or 365 years, and they give their reasoning below. So even though this Messianic era was described to be the 6th millennium, it was also described as a period that was going to last much shorter, and rabbis debated exactly how long this period was going to last. Some even saying it was going to last 40 years. Wow, that is so powerful. Well, this concept for a 40-year millennium, it has some basis in the scripture. And we can see this in Psalm 90. Now, Psalm 90 is a prayer by Moses. It's the oldest psalm we have, and it was written by Moses. And this is the one from which we get the famous quote, for a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. It says, for 1,000 years in your sight are just like yesterday when it is past. And Peter quoted this verse. And this kind of sets up a context. If you are thinking about the millennium being 1,000 years, this should already be ringing a bell in your head. Okay, he's mentioning 1,000 years. And it kind of hints at something to come. Well, he also says, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen evil. And the rabbis interpreted this as a prophecy of the days of the Messiah. The days of gladness were to be the days that the Messiah was reigning. And the days that you have afflicted us, that's debated to be either the time that the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, or the time that they were in slavery under Egypt. However, I believe that this was the period when they were wandering in the wilderness. because Moses is writing this, and he says, as many days as you have afflicted us, including himself. And he didn't count himself in the affliction of the slaves in Egypt, because he wasn't a slave. He was a Pharaoh, or he was under Pharaoh's court. So I believe when he's saying us, he's referring to himself, in that he wandered in the wilderness with the Israelites. And he's saying, make us glad for these many days. So if this is a prophecy of the Messiah's era, it would last for as many days as the Israelites were in the wilderness. And that's how this rabbi interpreted it. So that's really interesting. And there's some support for that. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 through 3, God's talking about how he let the Israelites wander for 40 years in the wilderness, and he humbled them. And that word humbled there, in Deuteronomy 8:3, that also means afflicted. So when David is saying in Psalm 90 that as many days as you have afflicted us, that's that same word for humbled that he used in Deuteronomy to describe the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So that's the first hint of support we have for a 40-year millennium in the Bible. But there's also more support in this idea of the ultimate Sabbath rest of God. In Psalm 95, God describes the Israelites' earthly promised land as merely a shadow of the ultimate rest to come. He warns the Israelites not to harden their hearts against this future rest, as the Israelites did in the wilderness. The 40 years of rebellion in the wilderness are compared to the period the Israelites would be given to accept this new rest. And let's read it here in context. He says, "Today, oh, that you would hear his voice. Don't harden your heart, as in Meribah, as in the day of Massah, in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, tested me, and saw my work. 40 long years I was grieved with that generation, and said, it is a people that errs in their heart. They have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they won't enter my rest." This is powerful because he's telling them there's going to come a future day when you'll have the opportunity to hear my voice. And when that day comes, don't be like the Israelites who ignored me in the wilderness and were sworn to never enter his rest. When this new opportunity comes to enter God's ultimate rest, pay attention so that you're sure to enter it. And there's this hint that this new opportunity would be 40 years long. They'd have 40 years to enter into this new rest. Well, Hebrews quotes this very passage, and it talks about how this new opportunity to enter God's rest had just been made available. And the Jews had this opportunity to enter his rest again. And he says, "For we who have believed do enter into that rest, even as he said, as I swore in my wrath, they will not enter into my rest," Psalm 95, "although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has said this somewhere about the seventh day. God rested from the seventh day from all his works. And in this place again, they will not enter my rest. Seeing therefore it remains that some should enter into it, and they to whom the good news was preached before failed to enter in because of disobedience, he again defines a certain day, today, saying through David, so long a time afterward, just as it has been said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." He's quoting that same passage. And then he says this, "For if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken afterward of another day." So the author of Hebrews is talking about the promised land. Joshua didn't give them the ultimate rest of the promised land. That was to come in the future. And he says, "There therefore remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For he who has entered into his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore give diligence to enter into that rest, lest anyone fall after the same example of disobedience." This is powerful. And what he's referring to here, this rest, he goes on throughout the letter to describe the new covenant and the ultimate heavenly rest, the new Jerusalem, which was coming out of heaven. And the Israelites in the first century were to move on from the old covenant rituals and put their faith in Jesus and rest from their human efforts to make themselves righteous before God, and instead trust in the righteousness that Jesus provides. And only in that faith would they be accepted into the heavenly Jerusalem, into the heavenly city. And that's what that's a picture of. It's so powerful. And you can see evidence of this in Hebrews 8, where he talks about Christ has gone into the true tabernacle, which is in the heavens. In Hebrews 9, where it talks about how the holy place, the heavenly holy place, wasn't made available while the first temple is still standing, and that's a symbol for their current age. It also talks about how Christ hasn't appeared in the holy places made with hands, but has gone into heaven. And it talks about how the saints of old, including Abraham, were waiting for a heavenly city whose builder and maker is God. And in Hebrews 11, it talks about how these martyrs and saints were desiring a better country, a heavenly one, and God is preparing a city for them. And in Hebrews 11, it says they didn't receive the promise. God was waiting until now, when the new promised land would be made available to all the saints together. And Hebrews 12 recapitulates this idea that we aren't to be like the Israelites who failed to enter the promised land. Instead, we need to be like the Christians who put their faith in Christ and will enter this heavenly promised land. Hebrews 12 says, verses 18 through 29, he's talking about the Israelites in Egypt. He says, "For you have not come to a mountain that might be touched, and that burned with fire, and to blackness, darkness, storm, the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, which those who heard it begged that not one more word should be spoken to them. For they could not stand that which was commanded. If even an animal touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. So fearful was the appearance of Moses, that Moses said, I am terrified and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable multitudes of angels, to the festal gathering and assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks a better word than that of Abel. See that you don't refuse him who speaks, for if they didn't escape when they refused him who warned on earth, how much more will we not escape who turn away from him who warns from heaven, whose voice shook the earth then, but now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, signifies the removing of those things that are shaken, as things that have been made, that those things which are not shaken may remain. Therefore, receiving a kingdom that can't be shaken, let's have grace, so that through which we serve God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. So he's saying this new heavenly Jerusalem, this is the kingdom that can't be shaken, that you are receiving. And this is a picture of the Israelites failed to enter into the Sabbath rest that God had prepared for them in the promised land. And they were a warning for the first century saints who shouldn't fall away from the new covenant, but should put their faith in Christ, and through which they would enter the new heavenly Jerusalem and receive that kingdom. And this has powerful connotations for the millennium because, as the early Christians and Jewish rabbis believed, the seventh millennium, the millennium that ended the Messianic era, that was the eternal Sabbath. That was when the kingdom of heaven was established. And just like the end of the millennium describes in Revelation 20 and 21, that was when the New Jerusalem was going to become available. And this is saying that they are about to receive that heavenly Jerusalem. And they have this period that's being compared to the Israelites. And he's quoting from Psalm 95. And we can see from Hebrews that just like the Israelites were given 40 years in the wilderness to accept the Messiah, or to put their faith in God and enter into the promised land, so the first century people were being given 40 years to put their confidence in Jesus before he returned so that they could enter into the kingdom of heaven. And this city was about to come, and you can see that in Hebrews 13:14. I'm reading in the Julius Smith translation. For here we have no abiding city, but we seek that about to be. Man, so this is powerful. So it may in fact be that Psalms 90, Psalm 95, and Hebrews 4 and 12 indicate that the millennium was to be a period of 40 years. It was the period, just like the testing of the Israelites in the wilderness, when they were led out of Egypt and would be coming into the promised land. And just like the Messianic era, the people who were in the world, the previous world, were going to have a time of turmoil before the kingdom was established. And that was going to be the cosmic Sabbath, the seventh millennium. Wow. So we see that if we put ourselves into the shoes of John's audience and how they would have understood these things, it might actually have made sense to them why the 1,000 years was actually a 40-year period. Because if they were all familiar with this context, that this is the Jewish culture they grew up in, and if it's the Christian culture they grew up in, John was likely using this language when he communicated to them. He was saying that the millennium, the messianic era, was describing this period that Psalms 90 and 95 compare to the Israelites in the wilderness, their 40-year wandering, that time of testing before the kingdom came. And this creates a powerful basis for how we could interpret the 1,000 years as a symbol to mean that 40-year period. And I believe it becomes necessary to interpret it as a 40-year period because the fact that it started with Christ's ascension and that it was sworn to occur without delay and soon at the destruction of the temple, roughly 40 years later, I don't see how we can make it a literal 1,000-year period. And especially given the fact that Revelation is a book of symbols, as it says in the first verse, and as the angel tells John to interpret it that way, we can also interpret the 1,000 years as a symbol for that 40-year period. Well, I appreciate you staying tuned for this series and watching these 2 videos on the end of the millennium. I hope you've enjoyed it. And in the next video, well, I'll leave that a mystery. I got to look it up again. But we're going to continue our series on the end times in the next videos and hopefully jump into some of the literal fulfillments of Revelation, how it happened in the first century, the symbols of Revelation, what they represented, and I hope you stick around for that. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, let me know. And also pray about the things I'm sharing with you and do your own research. Don't take my word for it. Please research these things for yourself and see if they hold true to the scriptures. So thank you and have a wonderful day.